cloud and financial services. First of all, I'd like to thank the New York Law School for this great venue. This is a very nice venue here, so thanks for that. And second, then, I'm going to turn this over to Kevin, who will start the panel and get the introduction started.
Great. Thanks, Rose. Thanks, everybody, for being here tonight. Hopefully the cookies and the wine will keep you awake and keep us interesting. So cloud computing is certainly nothing new, right? We've been talking about this collectively for quite a long time, probably for at least a decade, maybe, I don't know, but we give Salesforce.com the credit for making it sort of come into the public consciousness. All of my family pictures are now sitting on a cloud somewhere as well, rather than on a backup hard drive, but we're going to talk not about consumer usage, but financial services usage. And we'll go through intros and backgrounds in a minute, but financial services, in a lot of ways, the technology they use is advanced and probably some of the best in the world across multiple industries. We talk about high-speed trading and all sorts of other good things, quantitative trading, advanced models, algorithms, we'll get into that. But when it comes to adoption of some of these things that we take for granted in our sort of everyday lives, like cloud, we still got some ways to go, and that's, I think, what we're going to get into tonight. So maybe from that, why don't we just sort of go down the line, do some intros so everybody knows where we're coming from, and then we'll get started.
Sure, so thank you very much, and thanks for having me. My name is Mike Opal. I work at Microsoft, and I'm in our cloud group, and I work with a number of the financial services partners in the Microsoft partner ecosystem to help them help the end customers kind of bring them to cloud and kind of leverage that technology, hopefully for a competitive advantage.
I'm John Cowan. I'm the unadvertised panel member here tonight, the surprise member. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Six Fusion. Six Fusion's in the business of creating the economic standard by which we can interchange contracts for cloud computing. And we most recently announced back in September a project with the CME group to explore the concept of developing a legitimate spot exchange for buyers and sellers of cloud infrastructure.
I'm Jim Jockle. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Numerics. If you're unfamiliar with Numerics, we're really focused on solving the hardest quantitative problems on Wall Street, really focused on derivatives and derivative products. We started really in the exotic type market. By background, we have about 100 or so PhDs on staff building quantitative models, and it's really evolved over time as it relates to looking at where we are today in the market infrastructure, regulatory demands, and how that's implementing or affecting enterprise-wide risk management. So cloud has been a very inevitable path for us, especially when you start looking at the compute capacity and the demands for real-time risk in a lot of financial institutions today.
Thanks, I'm Rob Krugman. I work for Broadridge Financial Systems. I run digital strategy for Broadridge. Broadridge is, for those who have not heard of us, we're about a $4 billion public company that provides back office services to just about every broker-dealer in the United States. We have parts of our business deal with the securities clearing, where we clear about 45% of all U.S. equities go through our systems, about $4 to $5 trillion in fixed income securities on a daily basis. And then probably what we're most known for, though, is our communications business, where we really enable public companies, mutual funds, brokers, all different types of parties within the investment industry to communicate with their shareholders and their customers. And so we have huge amounts of information and data, and as we look to kind of migrate that data and leverage the cloud there, brings up some very interesting questions as far as security and how we do it in a way that those wonderful compliance officers are comfortable with.
Thanks, and I didn't introduce myself, so I'm Kevin McPartland. I'm the head of market structure and technology research for Greenwich Associates. Greenwich Associates is a research-based consulting firm, so we spend most of our time talking to thousands of financial market participants, so investors, traders, portfolio managers, technology professionals, exchanges, and look at how regulations, technology, behavior changes impact the markets and impact the business models of all of those people that we speak with. So with that, let's get into it. Like I said before, so cloud isn't a news story, but obviously a lot has changed over the last 5 or 6 years, particularly in finance. So I thought maybe a good way to start would be first let's talk about what's changed in finance, which I think brings us to why this conversation is more relevant now than it's ever been. And then from there, we can talk about what's changed in cloud over the last 6 years, and we can use that to get us to an intersection and start talking about some real life stuff. So let's go on the what's changed in finance. Maybe I'll throw it down to the finance end of the table first. I don't know, is that a bad categorization?
No.
The finance end and the tech end, but why don't I throw it down to you guys, and you want to just sort of go in from your perspective as what, I mean, obviously we know what happened in 08, so what's happened since?
Recovering technology guy as well, so I have strategy and tech background. So I can both sides. You know, I think one of the more interesting things that's happened in 08's part of it, I think, is the explosion of data. And I think that, you know, as you look at financial services, I think that there is a desire to gain a better understanding of what's going on, right? And I think where that started was a lot of the quantitative trading and stuff that you started to see, especially in the hedge fund community, start to leverage information and recognize you could generate serious alpha off of that information. And I think what's happened is that's really permeated itself through the entire organization, where companies are now looking at not always generating alpha, but risk avoidance, compliance. How do I then, you know, recognize that I have, as a financial services organization, huge amounts of information, right? And if I could figure out a way to use that data, there's significant value there. And financial services companies are pretty good at trying to identify value in the assets that they have. And I you know, as we've seen this kind of change evolve, and we've seen really, you know, the big data word is probably just as old as the cloud word. But it doesn't seem like you could read an article of just about any magazine without big data being on the front. And I think the reason for that is people are starting to recognize how you actually can use that information to do things. And that is better service your clients, personalize the service to customers, stuff that frankly, like other industries, like the retail industry in particular, has done so well. Financial services firms, I think, are just starting to recognize the value that you can actually use that information in with your own clients. And as, you know, I don't want to use the word sheep, but firms a lot look very much like each other. And if you want to distinguish yourself, you have to distinguish yourself in the way you communicate with your customers and the way that you demonstrate value and you bring value to the relationship. And it's very, very difficult to do that based upon the fact that I can help you do this or I can help you do that, because everyone can help you do this or help you do that. It's the information that you can give around doing those particular processes that becomes so interesting. That's why big data has become such a big word. That's why you see the formation of these new types of products and services that people are offering. And really to drive all that, that's where cloud comes in, because you can't do this in the infrastructure you have today without spending literally millions and millions of dollars.
And that's the key point. It's you know, financial services in particular, they're starting to realize the economic benefit, particularly from all these cloud-first apps. Everything that's being built new, net new today, is not being built for, you know, yesterday's infrastructure. It's being built for the AWSs or the Azures of the world. And so you're seeing immediately the economic benefits, and they're starting to ask very important questions like, what else can I do here, right? And the way that the industry has changed is that it's matured a little bit, right? I mean, I was part of the virtualization wave 10 years ago. That's when, when a small company called VMware came along and said, we can, get more use out of your physical box. And, financial services was the first one to raise their hand and say, we would never, ever do that on production systems. I need one application for one box. And here we are 10 years later, and more than 50% of the entire x86 footprint is virtualized, right? So the same evolution is happening in the industry called cloud computing today, and financial services represents the lion's share of the spend that goes on across vertical.
The commission issue also shouldn't be discounted, right? So firms are trying to do more with less, right? As the amount of bips you make on a trade or the transaction charges that you get from doing what you do as a financial services firm goes closer and closer as more transparency presents itself and people recognize what they're actually paying for the services that they're getting. It goes to that point, people are trying to save money.
Yep.
Right? And so, it's funny because you mentioned Salesforce before. I saw, it was one of the Dreamforce conferences where they got up and they were talking about the percentage of use on their actual applications and the number of servers that they have and the number of companies that are running on it. That gets people's attention, right? They have like 10,000 servers that run sales. You're like, how is that possible? If that was a financial services firm, we'd have 400 million servers and they'd be in all different locations around the world, and the cost would be just ridiculous.
The key challenge, I think, is kind of stepping back and saying, why are we looking at cloud? And, it's one is, how are you finding market opportunity? And especially as we have greater transparency in the markets, that adds a speed element to that, right? Because look at the equity markets and how they advance with algo trading, right? Once everything became transparent, the only opportunity was within speed and finding a smaller amount of bips or smaller amount of opportunity within speed. And we're even seeing that on the derivative side because we're continually seeing arguments now of, how am I looking at, interpolation as to options that are more out of the money? How do I create opportunities for greater trades? What about delta hedging on centrally cleared deals? How do I introduce elements of speed into that calculation? The other side is a response to market infrastructure. So if you think of a typical return on equity for an FX desk on the derivative side, or something along a structured products desk, where you're talking 15 to 20%, once you start overlaying different elements of charges, whether it be onerous charges like within the realm of XVAs, but then you start overlaying capital charges, one, how am I releasing liquidity? But if also I need more compute, more power, how am I reducing that cost of running that operation? So I'm getting better insight into my P&L, but at the same time, I have escalating compute costs to gain that speed advantage at the same time. So I think the cloud argument is accelerating because there is a huge cost and the margin return is shrinking rapidly.
Jim, I think you're right I think everybody's pretty much accurate on this one in the sense that there's a kind of confluence of events that are driving this cloud conversation. I mean, the fact that you're all here today is kind of is evidence of that. And I want to take it up even higher in the sense that expectations have changed. Whether it be regulators or customers, regulators, when they go home at night, they sit on their couch, on an iPad, and they look at their portfolio in real time, they make changes in real time, and they expect that when they go to talk to an institution, they're going to get that same level of speed and user ease from that bank. When the bank's like, oh, it's very complicated, it's going to take us months to run this job, that's just not acceptable. Like, I do that last night on my iPad, why can't I do this with you guys? So I think there's the expectation of real-time speed. And when you start talking about the amount of data that we as a human species, forget financial services, have kind of created, the only way to deal with that amount of data is to use something different, i.e. cloud. And when you start to leverage that, then you can give the regulators what they want, the consumers what they want, and allow financial service firms to chase alpha.
I was going to say, what's interesting about the regulator component of this is that, so as an industry, maybe healthcare, but I think financial services is probably more regulated than any other industry on earth. And what tends to happen with regulations is new regulations come out after problems happen. Mm-hmm. And you just pile on the regulations, and most financial service firms are not big proponents of it because of the cost associated with doing it. I think that, so one of the opportunities, in my view, that the cloud has to drive is the reason why these regulations are so onerous is because the data is so difficult to get access to. If you unlock and make that data easy to get access to, compliance becomes actually a heck of a lot easier, mm-hmm. right? We just got to get the compliance officers to agree that that's actually the case. But if the information's available and the data is available, providing regulatory information to the various regulators, all the different people you have to send it out to, becomes you can do it faster, you can do it easier, and then you don't have to deal with it because the regulator can then use a cloud-based service to actually analyze the data, find the questionable things, highlight the anomalies, and go back and ask further questions.
Well, just to build on your point, the CFTC came out last week in an interview when I was talking about, one of the elements of the new regulations is trade repositories as it relates to swaps. There's no data standards or the advancements of LEI initiative and things of that nature. They don't know what to do with it. They don't have the systems to analyze it. So they're getting the trade data, they're getting information, but nothing matches. So we're back, to the same 6-month, 8-month lagging reports from Basel III as to what the derivatives market looked like, and then we're still arguing what's notional, what's net, what's not. So, we're moving into a direction of transparency, but there's still a long way to go.
Well, what's interesting is, so the regulators, the new regulations are driving a lot of what we're talking about, and we'll get more to it in a minute. But the regulators themselves, who have puny budgets, right? So the CFTC's budget is what now, $300 million? Each of the top tier banks probably spends what, $2-3 billion a year on technology. Yep. So you've got the CFTC with its $300 million against the dozen biggest banks that are spending tens of billions of dollars. They're the perfect example of somebody that needs to think about how they can do this more efficiently and cost effectively.
Well, it's interesting. I was at so bringing it to cloud. So I was at AWS reInvent conference this year. One of the keynotes was a company called TradeWorks, their company in New York. They did a project with the SEC where they're basically putting every single trade that occurs in every U.S. market. They're putting it into a cloud repository, and then they're running. The purpose of creating this repository is that when something happens, they can essentially turn the dial to the exact trade, and then slowly go trade by trade to see what actually caused the problem, and they could replay that. Now, I believe that they're also now starting to use that data set and sell it to the hedge fund community who's very interested in it from a quantitative analysis perspective. But it highlights that this was not an overly complex system to put together. They're basically just pulling in the information as who the buy, who the sell was, how much it was, where the actual problems are, and then they can go to any point in time and be able to do that. It's going to be used for simulation analysis by many folks, but that kind of capability allows the regulators to do what they're supposed to do without putting an onerous amount of regulation on top of the people that are trying to actually make a living.
So one thing so in my job, I mainly focus on financial services, but I also look at a number of other verticals and partners. And I'm a financial services kind of person, so I kind of think, well, we're special and it's way more complicated financial services. But it's actually amazing. I was at a manufacturing conference not that long ago, and if you were to walk into this conference and listen to their regulatory challenges, it's the exact same challenge. It's just a different name. And it's amazing. Like, we think, oh, but Solvency II, very complicated. In manufacturing, they have to track back, all the supply chain, right? And the new regulations, just like CVA or Solvency II insurance, it's order of magnitude. So now instead of just chasing back, where did I get the plastic from? Where did these guys get the plastic from? And it adds that 10x load to the problem. And when you do it, the only really way to solve that problem is to have, scalable compute on hand when you need it. And it's actually, I'll be honest with you, it's amazing to me how similar, believe it or not, other industries are. And I say that, as a financial services person who thinks it's not possible, it really is. But pharma is a great example too. But they have the same challenges.
I mean, just to kind of bring that back, I mean, and this is multi-vertical as well, in the basic concept that, as data grows and as the demand for access to information grows and the demand for processing ultimately scales, it comes back to the basic notion that if you're not in the IT management business, you want to get out of the IT management business. And the nature of scale right now means that you better be damn good at what you do if you want to be in that IT management business. And what we're seeing is, providers, companies like Amazon, a bookseller, getting into the infrastructure as a service business, actually pioneering a business like that, because they happen to be very good at web scale architecture, right? And pushing that out into the market. The expectation that we all go ahead and do that is completely unrealistic. So you want to move to the concept of what we refer to as on-demand outsourcing, and that's really what cloud infrastructure is all about.
And that's also tied to 2008 though, and the reason it is that I think after 2008, after the implosion that occurred, companies started to recognize that I'm a bank, I'm a broker, I'm not a technology company, I'm not an infrastructure company. Why the hell am I doing these things? Right? There's other companies that can do this for a heck of a lot less money than I can. I can leverage these services when I need them and only when I need them. And it goes across, as a company that provides services to the service industry, it's a very good thing. Because, the companies start to recognize that if I have to do this and every single one of my competitors have to do this, why in the world would I do this myself? Right? And that it starts at services and then it goes down to the underlying infrastructure that needs to support those activities.
And do you think that's a broad mentality change? I mean, I was a computer science major. I went to JP Morgan when all my friends went to .coms in the late 90s because I thought Wall Street had the coolest technology it was JP Morgan where I started. So to me, it was like, here's a company that's throwing, and that was, like tons of money at the time to become as sophisticated. Everything was built in-house. And it sounds like that's reversing. So,
I think except for like numerics and like areas like hedge fund quantitative analytics and stuff like that. But if put yourself in those same shoes today, and actually it was funny. I was talking to a gentleman who used to be the vice chairman of Morgan Stanley, and he said, what the biggest problem with technology and financial services are? If you're a student getting out of college today, it used to be that you wanted to go work for Goldman or JP Morgan or somewhere else. Where do you want to work now? You want to work for Facebook, Google, Microsoft. You don't, and so instead of getting the A students,
Greenwich,
or data analytics, or go work for a hedge fund.
Right.
But to go work for a big brokerage organization or a big bank, really? Versus you can go over here and do the coolest things in the entire world.
I think IT is the complete problem, and in that regard, in terms of attracting talent. And Kevin, I know you publish really good estimates on spending in different areas, and I see different analyst firms. And when you really drive down into the numbers, yes, $1 billion is going to be spent on risk management over the next X years. 80% of that is maintenance of legacy systems. The other element is, how do I sit here and add value internally, right? So 5% of that cost is giving people back 15 minutes of their time, dealing with the consumerization of IT and bringing your own device to work and things of that nature. And then the other balance is, you know what, maybe we should outsource because we can't live in silos anymore. We can't develop in a desk-by-desk kind of environment. We need a holistic view of the organization. So how do we pull that together? And I think what we're continuing to see is, you know, what is driving outsourcing is keeping pace with new technologies, not just on the compute element, because I'm a bank, I'm not a data center or a data provider, but more of how do I stay on top of new technologies and take advantage of what's out there. You know, so
I'm sorry, yeah, I'm revving, I guess. So, no, it's interesting, and it's a good point that we've kind of, I think, come upon, is that I think financial services firms, and almost all corporate firms, have looked at IT as a competitive differentiator for themselves for the past probably 10, 15 years. So we spend more than gold, you know, what percentages, and they're fighting about that, right? And there comes a point where I think when this has changed, people are starting to realize that they're never going to be able to do it at the scale that an Amazon, a Microsoft, or Google could do it. I'll give you an example. So I was speaking to the CIO of a top 10 insurance company about a week ago. And they, and I have very much respect, that they looked at their data center, and this is our stuff. It's better than anybody else's. Like, ours is the best, and we want to make it the best. And his kind of comment to me was, you know, I've got this data center. I'm running 15,000 servers for just the actuarial department, which is a lot, right? And how could yours possibly be better? You know, how much more scale could you get? Because he was thinking we were running like 50,000 cores, right? And you know, the reality is, and it's a super, you know, NDA thing, but like in just the U.S., just the Microsoft cloud data centers in the U.S., they're not measured in thousands, 10,000s, or hundreds. It's measured in millions of servers sitting there waiting to roll. And we've built, and every cloud provider has built up a way to do that scale that is just, it's unprecedented. There's no way.
I mean, but the underlying infrastructure too is not a competitive weapon anymore. I hate to tell you this, right? Making that argument is like saying, well, I buy my gasoline from BP, not Texaco, so to hell with you. Well, come on, guys, it's gasoline. Let's talk octane. That's all we're going to talk about, right? That's literally what's happening to the underlying infrastructure assets, right? Which is why we believe that the utilitization effect is going to be the great unlocker of velocity in this business. If you can have interchangeability like you have in other commodity markets, this is going to explode. It's all of those legacy systems, which is that, you know, that picture of the iceberg, you got the big piece underneath the water and a little tip on top. A little tip on top is cloud. It's all that stuff underneath that we're trying to unlock, right? And so what we believe is that an open market for this is the way to do it.
So when I look out like 10 years, for example, I actually see something similar to what happened in the manufacturing space, you know, 100 years ago. You know, there was a time where factories produced their own electricity, and we produce better electricity than the person next door, and that's our advantage. And I think cloud is going to be like electricity. It's a utility, as you mentioned. Like, you're going to outsource it because it can be done at scale in a totally more efficient way, and let you focus on your business and being
it's an advantage and need also. I mean, I think you know, it's interesting. You know, one of the big problems I think financial services companies have is the investment that they've already made in IT.
Yeah.
We have 10, 15, 20,000 servers, and to explain to people that, yes, you can do it cheaper right here.
Yeah.
But as soon as you do anything different than that, you can't. There's just no way. And you can't virtualize the way a cloud can. You can't expand to, you know, 5,000 servers for the next 10 hours so you can do the analysis you need and then go back to the actual, you know, 50 cents a day it actually costs to run this thing. It's just, you can't compete in that model. And so, but when you recognize that, what it unlocks is unbelievable, because it unlocks so many services. I think it's gonna change technology generally, because, you know, are you gonna buy software licenses for major enterprise solutions anymore? Doubtful, right? Why would you buy a database when you could use a database for the next 15 hours that you need it, right? Why would you buy application servers? Why would you buy any of this stuff? You're gonna do it all in a cloud environment. You're gonna pay for what you need. It's complete. The model is completely switched.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that's changed is who the discussion is with. So traditionally, a software company would talk to the JPMC CIO or something like that, who's like, I've got a $6 billion spend and it's unbelievable. And that person, right, has employees and budget and power that they control. And they're hesitant to jump to cloud because they're going to lose all of that.
Yeah.
And what I've seen in the past, probably 6 months actually, is that it's not so much a CIO conversation anymore, it's a CFO conversation. And the CFO is like, what are we doing? Are you kidding? Like, I've got to take cost out of this business, and I can take, I mean, enormous cost out, and it's faster.
Well, I think it's also a lack of understanding. I think because people still associate it with hosting.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem, because when you explain to infrastructure people, you're still going to have as much control of your data center and where your content is and where it is than you always have. They get a lot more comfortable with the idea. I think the other barrier, and I think it's still going to be within financial services, is the issue of security.
Yep.
And I think it's a big barrier to overcome. I find it very humorous, though, because I'll make a few arguments. Like, one is, when Salesforce.com started putting all of your CRM data in the cloud, is there any more important data for a company? There's none. That's the most important data a company has, right? But the second piece, which is interesting, is people have this view that financial information is the most important information on Earth, right? Well, we know that you have this much money in this account, so God forbid someone get access to that. Really? I can make the argument for everyone in this room, the pictures that you store on Facebook are actually a hell of a lot more important than your statement from your broker, right? Because your statement from your broker, I can put your zip code into actually a machine, and I can figure out, generally speaking, how much money you have. Figure out, you can go to Zillow.com and figure out what your house is worth. And the pictures, they're a lot more valuable to you as an individual than a piece of paper that says how much money you're worth. And so now, that said, there's compliance and there's security people that play in our space. They're absolutely terrified by these concepts. And so I think it's going to be, that's why you're not seeing a huge migration all at once. It's going to be a slow migration, because the big question is, okay, where do I put the data?
I got to tell you guys a quick personal story, which I think really, we're dealing with a perception problem. I actually totally agree. The crown jewels of any organization, whether it's financial services or whatever, is the sales pipeline. That is the most critical thing, and it's all sitting in the cloud. All of it is today.
All next to each other.
All next to it, and nobody thinks in it. But this underscored to me the perception. So about 6 months ago, I went to a wedding. I live in Boston, in Delaware, with my wife, and it was like her family. And it was like a distant relative of hers, right? So we're at this table, the table like losers or something else. We're by the kitchen, you know what I mean? And it was the two of us and all these really old people, right? And like the great aunts of the people getting married. And so the people sitting directly next to us were this retired couple who traveled up on the East Coast in their RV, and they had like one cell phone between them, which was not like this. It was like a real like a cell phone, and totally untech savvy, right? And we're having a nice conversation. And so the woman says, she goes, "Oh, Mike, what do you do for a living?" I'm like, "Oh, I work for Microsoft." So nice, Yeah. She's like, "And what do you do there?" I'm like, "I'm in our cloud computing group." And she goes, "Oh, honey, you need to get a new job." I'm like, what are you talking about? And she goes, "Oh yeah, that's not going to work." What are you talking about? And she goes, "Yeah, no, there's too many security problems." And I'm like, what? I think I'm in a really good spot, actually. This is the future. And so I started kind of having this security discussion with this woman who, retired woman with a shared cell phone, right? And it was so funny. My wife is like, "Let it go. Don't worry about it." And I'm like, "No, if we lose her, we've got to win her, But it was just the way this perception is absolutely one of the major things we're doing. And I think what's interesting about the perception thing, and kind of go back in time, both first in financial services and then in your personal life. If you go back in time like 6 years, mobile banking, I know it's retail, so a little different than financial markets, but why was mobile banking not going to work? All the reasons the cloud's not going to work. There's security, compliance, all these issues. Now, when's the last time any of you used a PC for your banking? You use your phone, right? I mean, mobile banking is all the same. But on the other thing is, on your personal front, think about credit cards. Like, I would say myself, 6 years ago, when you would get to that point in a transaction, it was like, do you want to store your credit card information? Absolutely not. Are you kidding me? That's insane. Now, I'm irritated if I haven't put it in there because it's not. So we get accustomed to this stuff anyway.
But the interesting thing, the debate is actually starting to change. And, I was reading yesterday, it was some government magazine. It was talking about cloud usage in the U.S. government. And so the U.S. government has a program called FedRAMP, and FedRAMP sits and makes endorsements of who can use what with different services. And they're basically looking and announced different cloud providers and levels of security, et cetera. The biggest fear that we're starting to hear from many clients, they're getting past the security hurdle. It's more a fear of, it's drinking from a fire hose. Like, once I start using this, I mean, is this compute crack, for lack of a better term, that when I turn it on, is the price going to go, skyrocket, and then I don't have any control over this. So the debate's starting to change a little bit.
Yeah. So we're on question 1A of my list. So I thought that was a good break. So if there's any questions now, you can continue to just interrupt us, although I haven't had much luck interrupting, but if there's any questions.
You picked the wrong panel.
You're doing a great job.
It's the best moderator job ever.
Yeah. Hey, so anyway, Kevin, I'll just go on. No,
no, seriously, does anybody have any questions?
I do, actually. With the whole security issue that everybody is providing, I'm an underwriter for global technology, so when we do cyber liability, network and information security is obviously something that, we address and look to cover. Where is the line going to be drawn from the savings of cloud computing versus offsetting that to purchase all of the new insurance requirements that come along with this new space?
That's a really good question. I'm actually thinking about a deal that we're negotiating right now as you say that. And I think what's interesting is that the perception that you don't control security in the cloud, I think is part of the problem. I think that people have this idea that if I put information there, I have no ability to control what's actually there, right? You have the same control. I could actually make the argument that probably putting it in the cloud, you're actually able to secure it better than you're able to secure it on your own. And I think that is why, especially in financial services, I would suggest that the providers of cloud services who are going to win are going to be the name brands that you know. Because whether it's Microsoft or Amazon or Google, and I'll probably put Microsoft and Amazon in a little bit different place, and I'll explain why, so what happens to Amazon if AWS gets hacked? Right? It's catastrophic. I can make the argument that it's actually a much bigger deal than it is with Target. Right? Because Target's a place you walk in, you could pay cash, you could do things if people actually have cash anymore, but you could go and do that. But if you go, if you think about that in the perspective of kind of the online world and what that could actually mean to their brand, or could mean to Microsoft's brand, if something like this happened, what I see is a lot of the big companies, small providers can't do this, but really, really big brands can basically say, what we're going to put on top of this? Instead of insurance, it's kind of freaked out some of the people I'm talking about, especially on my side, was that we're going to put our brand, right? Our brand is worth more than any insurance we can ever get. And if we screw this up, the impact to our brand will be so high. That said, what I have found is that it very much is it's a shared model for security, right? You're using infrastructure. What is infrastructure? Infrastructure is data centers with security guards, right? And you don't want people to be able to access the underlying hardware. But because it's all virtualized, and you're virtualizing across so many different servers at the same time, your data is sitting in 4,000 different places all at once, that's really not a concern. It then comes to what kind of logical steps you want to do. Now, if you're a bank and you put all of your customer data unencrypted in a cloud, well, you get what's coming to you. But if you think about how you encrypt that information, and I think, and because of, you would never think of encrypting each piece of information differently if it was your hardware. But the infrastructure is so cheap that the concerns around security and the cost of actually, encrypting something and de-encrypting it for use in memory and stuff like that, it completely goes away. So you actually have so much more control over how you secure your own information. But getting people comfortable with that idea, that's frankly the challenge is, you go into a compliance organization, compliance organizations are overwhelmed with tasks, and it's so easy for a compliance person to say no.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I would just add to that is, from my perspective, we're looking at the cloud as infrastructure as a service, not SaaS. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of onus on us, even before data leaves on-prem and is distributed for compute. So it's not just, like working with Microsoft and Azure, the security levels of what's going on in terms of hybrid clouds or private clouds, but it's also what's happening before even one piece of data is leaving the premises. So, there's multi-levels of security, not just from you and your peers, but from vendors as well.
Well, it ties to privacy too, because I think that especially when it deals with consumer information, and I think we're seeing a major change in this. I think companies for a very long time has felt that any piece of information that they collected is there and they own it, and they can do whatever the hell they want with it. I think that we're seeing a major change in that, where companies are actually asking consumers for permission for what they can do with the information that's given to them. And that changes just about everything, especially from a legal perspective. It's one thing if you take data that's been given to you for one reason and use it for another reason, you're liable. But when you get data from a consumer and a consumer gives you rights on what you can and can't do with that information, that opens up so many different ways of using that information because you're doing it. The instructions, it's not me as an organization saying, I'm not asking you to do something, you're telling me it's okay to do something, and it sounds like it's the same thing, but it really isn't, because the consumer is the one that's in charge with their information, and I think that we're going to see a big evolution on that, tied to cloud computing, because it makes it much easier to do what you need to get done.
So security is the linchpin of the perception thing, right? And when I think about security, I think about it in two ways. One is, I think, physical security, right? With all due respect to anybody who works at JPMC or whatever, in terms of I think that the Microsoft, Amazon, Google data centers, from a physical security standpoint, are going to be order of magnitude more than anything you could produce. So, for example, the newest Microsoft data centers are built with moats, an actual moat around the building.
With sharks with laser beams?
Yeah, sharks, and it's to prevent tanks from being able to breach the building. So, if a tank, the only way out is to go to this little bridge, and the bridge is such that the weight of a tank would collapse.
Like, you're like in the Arctic Circle now, too, so you don't have to pay for air conditioning.
Gotta cool it. But so from a physical standpoint, I don't think anybody who's not in the business of doing that is ever going to touch that level of security. And then I think when we talk about IP security, it's on both of us, but it's really on you as well. One thing, and it sounds hokey, but it's actually not, is you brought up is trust. You can read all the reports, you can see what you're certified, but who do you trust to an extent with this data? And it is a hokey analogy, but I use it anyways, is you think about, in your life, who is the one person who you not only are fine with using them using your data, but you actually send them what your data is all the time? It's Santa Claus, right? As little kids, Santa, here's what I did. You tell Santa Claus what you did because you trust that Santa Claus is not going to be about that data. And it sounds like I don't think it is at all. You've got to trust your cloud provider at a level that goes beyond regulations and contracts.
Mike's going to be announcing a new Microsoft product called
Santa Claus. You don't know, it's coming. You'll hear the announcement. Satya's going to do the announcement.
I think the bigger risk than infrastructure and encryption and what have you is more in the user agreements for all of these services, right? I mean, the click-through agreements that we all encounter, both on the personal and on the business side, are gleaned more than any agreement I've ever seen, right? And the worst case of abuse that we've seen is one of these online storage providers who had a small statement in their EULA that said that in fact they have ownership rights to whatever is stored on this storage as a service product, which in business terms is an absolute nightmare. You start storing legal contracts, employee data, all these kinds of things, and that belongs to this cloud provider now of infrastructure. So I think the biggest risk in compliance has a lot more to do with legal than it does physical anymore.
The other thing with security, and actually Jim kind of brought it up in terms of numerics, picture firms like numerics who are kind of the big math, big data business of using big math to solve big data problems. They're using cloud for the infrastructure to do the compute. So they burst to the cloud, they use those engines, whether it be thousands, millions, whatever you want, how fast you want it, and they get it back. And they encrypt at their site. So they send gobbledygook to the cloud. So even if something would happen, it's worthless unless, so it is a little bit on yourself as well. But I think if you think about it, this is you're using this as an engine to drive your boat. That's where I think but your point too about the data, who owns it is important. But I think if you put that firewall, we're crunching the numbers, and
and that seems to be, I think once people started to recognize you can do that, that's what I think over the last 6 months in particular, you started to see companies say, oh wait, I can encrypt all of this information, and the only time it's going to be unencrypted is going to really be in memory. Yeah. Right? This is probably more secure than what I'm doing today in my own data center. Yeah.
And another question.
How does this conversation change as we move away from traditional finance mechanisms to virtual currencies? Security controls still come into play, but we know what's going on in the world. We're changing. Does the conversation stay the same, or does it change?
Well, I think it's tied to, in that case, it starts getting tied to identity. I think you can make the argument that one of the biggest concerns financial services firms have about the internet, social networking, whatever it is that you don't know that the other person is involved. right? It terrifies people. It's like,
Well,
how
it's
do
the same
I?
argument with the security. So I
Yeah.
want to be able to control my identity.
Yep.
That's what I'm trying to protect.
But the question becomes is, as you start to virtualize currency and you start to think about it that way, is who am I actually dealing with on the other end, right? Is it a Ponzi scheme? Is it a drug dealer? Is it some kind of oligarch sitting in Russia? You don't know, right? So I think that what you're going to start to see happen is all this stuff starts to happen, and you have the virtualization of all different types of assets. There's going to be a need to be able to figure out who you're communicating with. In certain cases, not in all cases, but in certain cases it becomes very, very important. I would say in particular in the financial services firms, because there's so many rules around where you can trade, what you can do, right? Can these people trade? Can people from this country be allowed to play in this particular marketplace? You could virtualize the currency you want, but there's still going to be rules that are going to be in play with the way the actual markets work themselves. And so I think that there's a level of identity when it's necessary is going to become very, very important. Yeah.
And I would actually take that up a little bit and say, the financial services landscape, we tend to think that these are banks, they compete with other banks, and there's little credit unions. But what is the threat to financial services as an industry? And I think that's non-financial services firms coming in and taking the whole thing, to be honest with you. I mean, Walmart, when Walmart wanted to get into the banking business about 8 years ago, they went away. Everyone was, oh, thank God, they're gone, we don't have to worry with them. But they're going to be back. And other people are getting back. Maybe Facebook, maybe cloud, who knows? But they're going to come back, and they're going to come back in a way where they're going to be so fast and agile because they're not tied down to these giant IT budgets. They're going to smoke.
Well, that's a great point. So we've been talking a lot about what the holdbacks are. I think it's probably a good transition to talk about what actually is going on now. So we talk about Salesforce and email, right? That stuff, we're pretty far along the curve, right? There's some good adoption there. But if we talk about, to me, what feels like real cloud, like compute and storage, if you're talking to a new hedge fund, somebody who's got $100 million and they're going to start up, that's a pretty easy discussion, right? I mean, it's all new. They're going to go with the latest technology. So what about everybody else, though? What about the existing hedge funds, right? The conversations we've had, it's still very much, or the ones that are in are very much early adopters. They're trying to pick small points where they can dabble a little bit and figure out how this stuff works. And I think the bank conversation is probably different than the asset manager hedge fund conversation. So anyway, with that lead in, let's talk. It'd be great to talk about some real world, like what's actually happening today. Where do you see the growth, and what should we expect? I guess in the next year or two, where will the real pickup be? So I don't know, Jim, you want to start off with that?
It's an interesting question because we talk about the adoption curve, and I think the curve is a little bit further along than we all. It's all publicized. A lot of the buy side are much more comfortable with SaaS. They're much more comfortable being consumers of technology from prime brokerage, especially on the smaller side. So there's the barriers are not as high. Where the barriers exist, and I'll throw out 100 million AUM as kind of a gap, is having the internal resources to onboard IT. But that said, post 2008, when a lot of people were leaving the banks and they started going to hedge funds, they didn't have the tools that they were used to. They didn't have the tools they needed to do their jobs effectively and find alpha in their new lives. And that facilitated more onboarding of technology, but it also, because it was low cost and the barrier or fear didn't exist to outsource, whether it was outsource technology, outsource to cloud, and I think AWS was a rapid adopter in that let's call it SMB kind of segment of where it was. I think the adoption curve is further than we all think, but we're also talking about an industry that is secretive by nature.
Yep. So
any competitive advantage, whether it's the calculations that they're doing or the underlying analytics or how they're getting their compute, is all being held very, very close to the vest.
It's interesting because we're talking about like it's a commodity, but then on the other hand, they don't want to talk about it because they think that it gives them an advantage over their competitors.
Well, I think they're also, what we have found very interesting is that firms are scared of this. They particularly hold their service providers accountable as far as where this information is. But what we have found, especially in our larger clients, almost every single one of them is using cloud technology in one way or the other. Now, a lot of it, I would say, is for newer ideas and newer projects and what they're storing, and they're putting their toes in the water and they're starting to kind of put information in. I think the data bursting is a real easy one, because when you have to analyze so much data at a short period of time, and a lot of the data is not really, it's market data, right? It's not secure information. This is information that anyone can get access to. So I think there's comfort there. I think it's when you get to the PII information and you get to information about your client base, that's where I think there's still a level of stickiness or still a concern, and they want to own it. And I think that's firms are starting to kind of get involved in it, and I think that their disruption is going to drive some of it, especially as you kind of mentioned, the newer companies that are disrupting existing companies. As they get more involved, I think you're going to see people going to do it because they have to do it. But I think the other aspect of this is that they're paying attention to what their clients do, right? So we did an analysis not too long ago, and we looked at products like Evernote and Dropbox, and all the archive platforms over there. The most commonly stored piece of information in one of those archival platforms is financial information. People basically have replaced the file cabinet in their basement with Evernote or with Dropbox or with Box. They're putting all that data there, right? And so there's a thought process that says, well, if that's our PII, if that's the data that's about our customers and what they do and what they use it for, should we be rethinking this and saying, well, how do we put it there in a way that we feel more comfortable with from a security perspective, because we're supposed to be the organizations that people trust, right?
Well, we talk about disruption as if it's a flick of the switch, but disruption is, you wake up and really 5 years have gone by, and all of a sudden everything
10.
appears to be different. 10. And I think one of the interesting things is just thinking about the business model, and not just going back to banks, right? So you've got the regulatory drivers, right? Banks are not supposed to be risk takers. Let's make the hedge funds more, and buy side more risk takers, make the banks more systemically safe to the country. And so what's that disruption? And who's using cloud? Well, you're seeing a trend to move to assets under management, gain the stability of wrapping up AUM and deposits and things of that nature. And then you've got others in the custodial world who are figuring out, how do I become the platform, and how do I service others? And everybody's fighting to be the platform. I mean, you see that on the software vendor side, I see that on the bank side, and how do we outsource that? So I'm reducing my cost to equity here, but I'm building up infrastructure over here because I'm going to outsource that and wrap that up. So that disruption curve is already, that ship's left.
But it's interesting because it's starting, because if you think about banking, like think about payments, the way you pay people. You mentioned payments before. Where payments has been disrupted, I don't think you can put on TV for more than 15 minutes and see a commercial for a way to basically use your telephone to pay your friends.
Yes.
Right? It's those personal peer-to-peer type payments where we went out for dinner, here's $30, or maybe pay the restaurant with your telephone or something like that. It's a baby step, because that's not really payments. That's basic payments. Where payments starts to get interesting when you're talking about payments between parties, right? Pay your electric bill that way. Pay different content like that. And I think what we're starting to see is you're starting to see these are the baby steps companies have taken to disrupt the payment space, right? So you're going to see new types of companies there. I think on the capital market side, and probably on the retail brokerage side first, we haven't seen that happen yet, right? The last major disruption was electronic trading, right? Was you can go online and you can buy stock for $7. We haven't seen it. I think social media is going to play a role in this. I think the social network and the concept, the way people want to know how they're doing in relation to their peers, and that never existed before in financial services. People want to now be able to, and we haven't seen the disruption occur, but you could see it's coming. There's a lot of interesting smaller companies that are starting to kind of participate and saying, we're going to do it a different way. We're going to do this. And no one's gotten the secret sauce yet, but when it happens, you're going to see massive disruption.
Well, and it's going to have to be drips and drops, right? And so because of how the budget cycle tends to work in these organizations, and I could quite frankly see this in our company, right? If we said we should move all of everything that we have on our file server should be in the cloud, it would be, well, what's our IT budget for 2014? Oh, it's, I don't know, it's $10 million. This would cost $2 million. We just can't do it. Even though it would probably save $1 million a year, we can't afford to do it now, so we just won't do it. All right, and for the bigger banks, the bigger asset managers, that's a really big hurdle for them to get over, is convincing somebody to spend the money now for the savings later, because people like they're focused on financial statements and all that.
Well, it's funny, Mike and I've had this conversation a couple times, is, you know, in marketing or marketing the cloud or talking about cloud, we always talk about the what if, the biggest things in the world, right? You know, well, we can run counterparty risk, you can have it real time, and you know, forget that it's a overnight batch process and hit your regulatory windows. You know, we'll just throw 3,000 cores at it. It's no problem. You're going to have it in less than 5 minutes. That's awesome. But the truth of the matter, and where we're working with a lot of clients, is how do I take my Excel spreadsheets and burst them to cloud and take a process that took 12 minutes where I would get up and go coffee and white screen and get that back in a minute and a half. And the path to adoption is really these smaller consumable projects of, I just need this vault service now, and you know what, that's great. I'll reinvest my entire architecture later, but I've got a business problem, and how am I going to solve it?
And I'd imagine in those situations, it's you go in there, you add a little plug into Excel, and they don't even know what's happening. All they know is that it comes back fast.
Yeah, no, we built it ourselves.
Yeah.
It's just a little
and that integration is really the key to all of this, is making it so easy.
So, you know, from the adoption curve standpoint, you know, obviously Microsoft, we track to the, you know, nanosecond cloud usage. And it's actually very interesting to see in financial services where the cloud is used. And it's really in two buckets. The first one is bursting. So like, I've got this huge spreadsheet. I have an advantage over my competitor if I can get it faster. So all bursting, I mean, you'd almost be crazy not to take advantage of it, right? So plus you can encrypt at your site, so it removes a lot of these kind of hurdles. So there's that, and the other one is backup and recovery. Yes. You know, like disaster recovery, because it's a very natural, like having it somewhere else is a better thing as opposed to having it on premise, and it's really those two spots.
Yeah, sell Iron Mountain.
Yeah. No, exactly.
There's no reason to store paper anymore. I mean, the amount of paper that financial services companies have stored forever, it's shocking. Mm-hmm. And if you can, I mean, there's no cost.
Yeah.
Archival, there's no cost anymore.
I mean, the great example actually is Cowan. I don't know if you guys know Cowan at all, but they're a backup recovery provider. And they are in New Jersey, just where when the hurricane came ashore, their office was swamped, like in a foot of water. And they all backed up to the cloud, right? And all their clients did. And they were a tremendous case study of like, if they had everything on premise, they would have been destroyed. And they were never down for a moment. And so there's that. We are getting that curve, but it's those great use cases of like, you know, we find alpha, we find money. Or we're taking this thing which we're kind of accustomed to sending to Iron Mountain, we're just sending it somewhere else.
Well, I think there's also the other part, disaster recovery has been very interesting as well.
Yeah.
One of the first systems that we launched in the cloud, one of the big things we recognized is disaster recovery is a completely different thing. Yeah. You literally don't need disaster recovery anymore, because if you're leveraging the cloud properly and you're across a number of regions and data centers, it's by default.
Yep. Don't say that to compliance officer.
No.
Bank.
Sorry, yes.
So, back up, schmack up.
My company is a VAR, value-added reseller, and we're one of the one of the most active Dynamics, GP, ERP, and also Microsoft Dynamics CRM providers in the country.
Well, I'll buy you a drink afterwards, so thank you for that.
We're seeing, speaking of adoption, I was just wondering how you see the United States as compared to Europe, which I think has been leading us tremendously in some of the things we've been talking about, especially electronic payments, mobile payments, and so forth.
Awesome.
I would say that you know, the EU and North America in general are two animals that are really governed by data sovereignty rules. That's really what defines those markets. You know, things like the Patriot Act in the United States has created you know, a wealth of opportunity north of the border. I'm Canadian, so I can say check the box on that one, guys. Good job. But you know, the data export laws and regulations in Europe are slowing down the adoption, right, of on-demand services, because I can't necessarily, and because there's so many different you know, laws and regulations country by country, I have to be very concerned about whether or not the data is actually being exported across a border, right? And that's slowing the pace of adoption, generally speaking. And like I said, you know, the dynamic in the U.S. around, you know, again, you know, the perceived reach into your data that the government has is creating a flight risk, right, for computing big jobs or potentially secure jobs in this on the soil. So that's how I would characterize the differences in terms of what you know, what's going on. But you know, either way you slice it, government's doing nothing to increase the adoption of these new services. That's for sure.
It's funny. You know, regulatory arbitrage is a very interesting environment right now, especially as I kind of focus on derivatives. So a lot of the barriers are removed in Asia, especially as we're trying to start to see some shifting in money centers, South America. But if you're talking Germany, Japan, and Canada, you know, they're leaders in terms of data privacy and burst and what information is going to be able to go up and go down. I think there's a confluence of events as it relates to government budgets looking at their own. So, you know, I know FedRAMP in the U.S. has opened up cloud usage, which creates a de facto adoption for many institutions outside of the government. We're seeing the same thing, I think, in the Nordics. We're seeing the same thing in Ireland. We're seeing the same thing in the UK. And all of a sudden, you know, the conversation continues to accelerate. So, you know, there's multi-levels of regulation that are driving different levels of adoption for different reasons.
So I think we have like 3 minutes. We're going to get kicked out. So you are the lucky last question.
Can I just, real quick, just because I spent a fair amount of time in Germany just recently, actually, speaking to a bunch of the German firms.
You didn't go to a relative's wedding there?
No, I didn't actually. I didn't. No.
All right, carry on.
Yeah.
But she was there.
Yeah. And a lot of the problems, I shouldn't say problems, like I understand actually why Germany, Switzerland are far more hesitant than the rest of the EU to adopt cloud. And I think I'm impressed by that. But a lot of these problems deal with number of data centers available. And you know, as we're sitting here, like more are being built, it takes a while, but these problems are going to solve themselves. I mean, basically, same with China. Like, you've got to have data centers in jurisdiction. Yep. And that's going to be that's in the process.
Those rules will change eventually as well.
They'll change, and the problem will solve itself when there's data centers sitting in the German border. So we're not there yet, but I feel like we'll get there pretty soon. Sorry about that.
So, can you address the question of a private cloud and how that fits in and what you feel the market is for that?
I think that's you've talked about putting your foot in the water. That's exactly where most companies are thinking about. And I would say it's private cloud versus, I always use the word virtual private cloud. It's kind of an extension of your own data center, and using that as the way to get started. I would expect in financial services that we're going to see that for quite a while. They're not going to put the data in the public cloud. They're going to be willing to make an investment of X amount to have a certain amount of servers. They're virtualized servers, but that's the stuff you control. That's your data center. And then for bursting purposes, they may go into the public cloud, but they'll be very careful of what they actually put there. To start, though, it's going to be all virtual private cloud.
So they don't achieve all the benefits of...
Correct. They don't, but it makes everyone smile and get the approval to get the check.
Not to create a Microsoft commercial, but if I could, I will. I think there's limitations between AWS, which buy side doesn't have that same kind of restriction as compared to banks, which are under different jurisdictions that are looking at more private clouds. I'm going to leave that to you because my memory's a little fuzzy on that. But
so I love the commercial, but I also want to say I think a good example is SunGard. So FS Cloud, which SunGard has, is kind of their picture, kind of like a public cloud that's a SunGard cloud to make people feel better about
this.
It's
FinCloud.
Yeah, it's
came out with.
Yep. So they kind of created their own private cloud for their customers to move to cloud without getting to the scary public cloud, and it's actually been very successful for them. But they're running into scale because now people want to go there, and you just can't. So now they're bursting to public clouds. But so the voyage to cloud starts at private cloud, whether it be your own, a big firm, or like a SunGard, FS Wet, or FS Cloud. But I think the end game is a utility. Is
what scares me the most is that a lot of firms think that they actually create a cloud.
Yeah.
And that's the first step they take. They say, well, we can just virtualize all our servers and we'll have a cloud.
I think that the concept of private cloud is obviously here to stay, but for very different reasons. And I think that what is going to drive a lot of the adoption is the ability to hedge risk, right? I mean, we're focused heavily on concepts around de-risking some of these equations for buyers of infrastructure, right? So if there was such a thing for an open market for this infrastructure, and you could divest yourself of certain contracts or certain physical assets, it wouldn't matter whether you bought the assets yourself and stored them in your own data center, or you subscribed or purchased a contract from the public cloud. If there was what we refer to as economic interchangeability, if there was a way to effectively apply traditional, existing hedging strategies in other markets to infrastructure, right? And if you can get to that point, the concept of private cloud or public cloud, it doesn't really matter anymore.
We're literally going to get kicked out of the room in like 3 minutes, I'm told. So.
But we're having fun.
Yeah,
Let me see him try,
yeah, we can go talk on the couch. Yes.
But one little last point of why, when companies are looking to public cloud or internal private cloud, it's once you start peeling back the layers of reprogramming how many codes of .NET and x86 elements of billions of lines of code of backward legacy, then you're sitting here going, well, now I got to go through a parallelization. Now I'm going to open up the CPU, GPU debate, right? Now I've got that entire cost budget of recoding when, it becomes a much longer, bigger issue. So
thank you very much to the panel. It was a great discussion, and thanks everybody for coming.